on the 13th of October 1399, the man who had until recently been known as Henry Bolingbroke was crowned as King Henry IV of England at Westminster Abbey, which was then outside of London. The coronation marked the end of a whirlwind of events that year, in which Henry had gone from political exile in France to become the ruler of England. Henry had fallen out with the reigning monarch, Richard II, during the 1390s. Richard was a sovereign who had ascended to the throne as a child of 10 years in 1377. After he came of age and began to rule in his own right in the mid-1380s, Richard had alienated a large percentage of the political community and nobles of England. These actions led to several crises. Richard had survived previous bouts of opposition, but the events of 1399 were different. Henry's father, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, the most powerful noble in the realm, and Richard's uncle, had died in February. Richard had then moved to prevent Henry from automatically succeeding to his father's extensive estates in Lancaster and elsewhere in England. Thus, in the summer of 1399, while Richard was away on a military expedition to Ireland, Henry crossed to England and signalled his intent to depose Richard. The leading nobles of the realm flocked to Henry's cause. When Richard then returned from Ireland late in the summer, he found he had lost control of his realm. He was soon captured and died the following year in captivity, most likely after being starved to death. Henry's actions led to the ascent to the throne of the House of Lancaster, so named after the fact that his father, John of Gaunt, had held the Duchy of Lancaster. Within half a century, there would be growing unrest about Lancastrian rule in England, ultimately triggering the Wars of the Roses with the House of York. This is the story of the House of Lancaster, and how the family claimed, then lost, a kingdom in a period of just over 60 years. The Duchy of Lancaster, from which the House of Lancaster derives its name, is not entirely synonymous with the Lancaster region in Lancashire, northwestern England. Instead, the lands held by the duchy are found generally in the northwest and north of England, located in counties such as Lancashire, Cheshire, Staffordshire, Derbyshire, and Yorkshire. This is a part of England which had been at the forefront of conflicts in England for hundreds of years, even before it had come into the possession of John of Gaunt in the 14th century. In the 9th century, these lands were the front lines of clashes between the Anglo-Saxons and the great heathen army of the Danes or Vikings, who had invaded this part of England in 865. Later, this region fell under the control of the Danish kings of Northumbria, before it was gradually conquered by the rulers of the Kingdom of Wessex. The kings of Wessex were to unify England under Anglo-Saxon rule in the 10th century. The northern parts of England established a tradition of defying royal rule in the south as early as the 11th century. It was then that Tostig, Earl of Northumbria, defied his brother King Harold Godwinson and was exiled from England as a result. After William the Conqueror led his Norman followers from northern France to conquer England in 1066, he established one of his closest followers, Roger of Poitou, as a leading landholder in the northwest. The power base of the north was therefore an important one, where nobles in the northern regions could build their strength, either as trusted bulwarks of royal rule or as would-be rivals of the crown. Before John of Gaunt became associated with the Duchy of Lancaster, the duchy was already connected to the wider royal family in England in the post-Norman conquest era. The kings of England from William the Conqueror onwards were cross-channel rulers, presiding over the Kingdom of England on one side of the English Channel and extensive lands in northern and western France on the other. The French lands of England's rulers grew through marriage alliances and inheritances in the 12th century. These marriages also resulted in a new branch of the royal family coming to power in 1154. This was the House of Plantagenet, from which the House of Lancaster would ultimately emerge. The earliest member of the royal family to hold a senior aristocratic title tied to Lancaster was Edmund Crouchback. He was a son of King Henry III, one of the longest ruling monarchs in English history, holding the throne from 1216 to 1272. During the reign of Henry's father, King John, much of the English royal family's French territories had been lost to the French crown. This was a development which would have consequences for English history for hundreds of years, especially for the House of Lancaster. Edmund Crouchback was born in 1245. In order to offset the danger posed by rebellious northern lords like Robert de Ferrers, 6th Earl of Derby, Edmund was made Earl of Leicester and Lancaster in the mid-1260s. Edmund was in turn succeeded by his son Thomas after his death in 1296. While Thomas had no legitimate children to succeed him, the earldom of Lancaster passed to another of Edmund's sons, Henry, not long after Thomas died in 1322. Both Thomas and Henry were extremely powerful lords, based on their estates in Lancashire and other parts of the north. As such, they were leaders of opposition to their first cousin, King Edward II, who was overthrown and killed in 1327. The power of these northern lords, Thomas and Henry, again emphasizes the manner in which these nobles could readily resist the will of the crown in the south. Edward II was succeeded by his son Edward III. He would rule for 50 years down to 1377. The emergence of the House of Lancaster as a force powerful enough to challenge their rivals, the House of York, was the direct result of the complex politics of Edward's reign. Edward was only a child of 14 years when he ascended to the throne. During the first years of his reign, the realm was ruled by Edward II's widow, Isabella of France, and her lover, Roger Mortimer, the first Earl of March. Edward and his supporters eventually overthrew them, and Mortimer was executed in 1330. Then, in 1337, Edward went to war with France. King Charles IV, the last direct king of the French royal house of Capet, had died in 1328. As a result, the House of Valois had come to power in France, even though by law Edward III had a greater claim to the French throne than Philip of Valois, who nevertheless became Philip VI of France in 1328. In 1337, after growing into his adult years and fully securing control of England, Edward went to war with the French, and then in 1340 he began pressing his claim to be the rightful monarch of both France and England. This was the beginning of the 100 Years' War, a conflict which ebbed and flowed over the next century. The oscillations of this conflict would have a significant impact on the varying fortunes of the House of Lancaster and its rival, the House of York. In the 1340s and 1350s, Edward III generally gained the upper hand in the fighting, regaining many of the territories lost in the north and west of France in King John's time. Thereafter, England suffered some reverses, and the war stagnated for much of the second half of the 14th century. Edward III had 13 children, 8 sons and 5 daughters, through his marriage to Philippa of Hainault, the daughter of a prominent lord of the Low Countries. Virtually all of their daughters, other than Isabella, Countess of Bedford, died young. 3 of the sons died in infancy too, but 5 of them lived. The Wars of the Roses were the direct result of conflict between the descendants of these 5 sons. The first son was Edward, the Black Prince, born in 1330. For most of Edward III's reign, he was recognized as the heir to the throne. However, he died in 1376, months before his father did. Therefore, it was his son Richard who would ultimately succeed Edward III as King Richard II in 1377. The next eldest adult son of Edward III was Lionel, Duke of Clarence. He only had one child before he died in 1368, Philippa, Countess of Ulster. Her descendants would play an important role in legitimizing the claim to the throne of the House of York. The third of Edward III's sons to survive infancy was John of Gaunt, the founder of the House of Lancaster. He was born in 1340, the year when his father first laid claim to the French crown. The fourth son, born a year later in 1341, was Edmund of Langley, who went on to become Duke of York, a title which was later held by the very House of York that would go on to challenge the Lancastrians in the 15th century. Finally, the fifth of Edward III's adult sons was Thomas, Duke of Gloucester. His direct male line died out within a generation, but Thomas's grandson, Humphrey Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, played an important role in the Wars of the Roses. The House of Lancaster was founded by John of Gaunt. He would never become King of England himself. Instead, his son, grandson, and great-grandson would. Nonetheless, John was a colossus of English politics in the second half of the 14th century. Initially, his position as the third of Edward III's adult sons could have resulted in him being a fairly marginal figure, overshadowed by his two older brothers, Edward the Black Prince and Lionel, Duke of Clarence. What changed matters in a very real way was John's marriage to Blanche of Lancaster at Reading Abbey in 1359. This took place when he was 19 years old, and she was 17. The death of Blanche's father, the Duke of Lancaster, 2 years later, opened up the possibility that John would succeed to the family's titles and estates. This was because the Duke did not have a male heir. A year later, John's father, King Edward III, confirmed that John would succeed to the Lancastrian inheritance when Blanche's only other sibling, her older sister Maud, had died without having any children. Thus, at 22 years of age, John became the largest landowner in northern England and one of the most powerful nobles in his father's realms. Furthermore, the Duchy of Lancaster was recognized as a county palatine. This was a medieval concept whereby an estate or region was deemed to have quasi-autonomy. Palatine rulers were rare, but they held an unusual level of power within their lands. The palatine status of the Duchy of Lancaster would continue to have consequences for the lands John inherited in 1362, even beyond the days of the House of Lancaster. Its impact continues to be felt even in the early 21st century, as we will see. John of Gaunt did a lot more than simply acquire the Duchy of Lancaster through his first marriage and found the House of Lancaster. He was a substantial figure, one who played a major role in the 100 Years' War. There was a temporary cessation of hostilities between the English and French crowns at times in the 1360s. By the end of the decade, intense fighting had recommenced. John campaigned in northern France at this time, while his brother, the Black Prince, was engaged in a larger campaign in western France. He occasionally tried to link up with his brother. There was little breakthrough in the fighting at the same time, and it continued intensely well into the 1360s, with John campaigning for lengthy periods in France. This most famously led to a chevauchée, a lengthy cavalry expedition through the country in 1373, in which John led thousands of men from the Channel port of Calais to the city of Bordeaux in southwestern France. The Chevauché campaign had been a remarkable feat, but it was in fact the French who gained the upper hand in this period of the 100 Years' War. This was because a disaster soon struck the English. On the 8th of June 1376, the Black Prince died. Many historians argue that this was down to a lengthy case of dysentery, though other conditions like internal organ failure cannot be ruled out. He left behind a single legitimate son, Richard, who now became the heir to the throne. This was problematic. Richard was only 9 years old when his father died, and his grandfather, old King Edward III, was entering his mid-60s and in poor health. The king died almost exactly a year after the Black Prince. With this, King Richard II ascended to the throne at only 10 years of age. John, Duke of Lancaster, now became a pivotal figure in the realm. John's other older brother, Lionel, Duke of Clarence, had died back in 1368, meaning that John was the eldest uncle of the king, and as such, a critical figure during his nephew's minority. John would play a major role in running England until such time as Richard grew a little bit older and was deemed to be fit to rule in his own right. Concurrently, John was pursuing his claim to another throne altogether. His first wife, Blanche of Lancaster, through whom he had inherited his vast estates in Lancashire and other parts of the north of England, had died in 1368. She had possibly contracted the bubonic plague in a new wave of the Black Death, which had devastated the continent during John and Blanche's childhoods. 3 years later, John married Constance of Castile, one of the kingdoms of Iberia that would unite to form the Kingdom of Spain at the end of the 15th century. Constance was the daughter of King Peter of Castile. He had been overthrown and killed by his brother Henry, who became King Henry II of Castile in 1369. As the eldest surviving child of Peter, Constance had a claim to the throne of Castile, which John essentially inherited once he married her in September 1371, near Bordeaux. A few months later, in January 1372, John began styling himself as King of Castile, in opposition to Henry II, his wife's uncle, who was deemed to be a usurper. He also added the Castilian royal coat of arms to his Lancastrian coat of arms. John would eventually undertake an expedition to Spain to try to enforce his claim to the throne of Castile. However, this did not take place until 1386, and by then Henry II had been succeeded by his son, King John I of Castile. Even so, it is worth noting that before any member of the House of Lancaster became a King of England, John of Gaunt held a claim to being King of Castile by right of his second marriage. John did not return to England immediately after his failed Spanish expedition in 1387. He retreated to Portugal, his ally in the war with Castile, and later sailed for Aquitaine in western France. He remained there for a time, and it was not until late in 1389 that he finally returned to England. In the interim, more problems had arisen in Richard II's reign. Richard had started to rule more directly after he turned 14 in 1381. He became more assertive in the mid-1380s and was engaging in actions which were ruffling the feathers of many of the senior nobles of the realm. John was a moderating influence on his nephew, but after he headed off to launch his Castilian expedition in 1386, a full-blown crisis began in England. The immediate spark was the convening of a parliament in October 1386. Here, the king's ministers requested a very high tax subsidy in return for entering into any discussions about concessions to the political community. Several of the most senior nobles then joined together to lead the opposition to the government over the next 2 years, expressing their reservations about how well Richard was being advised, and calling for the dismissal of some of his ministers. In the middle of the unrest, Henry Bolingbroke, John's eldest son and heir, who turned 20 years of age in 1387, and was only 3 months younger than Richard, joined the opposition group known as the Lords Appellant. This was the first open episode of defiance of Richard by a member of the House of Lancaster. The Lords Appellant were broadly successful, and by 1388 the resistance to Richard was such that the king agreed to dismiss several of his less popular advisers. 2 of them, Sir Robert Tressilian and Sir Nicholas Brombre, were even condemned to death. Henry Bolingbroke had won this first salvo in the rivalry between himself and Richard. In the 1390s, John of Gaunt's personal life shifted in a way which would have a bearing almost a century later in the resolution of the Wars of the Roses. This was through a relationship which made it seem as though the House of Lancaster was being preserved even as the House of Tudor claimed power. All the way back in the 1360s, when John was married to Blanche of Lancaster, a young woman from the Low Countries, Catherine de Ruyt, was employed in the Lancastrian household. There she married Hugh Swynford, a knight who served John of Gaunt. Later, when Blanche died, Catherine took on a more active role in John's household, helping to raise the Duke's children. Her husband died in 1371, the same year that John married Constance of Castile. Constance lived until 1394, but throughout the entirety of his marriage to her, John was engaged in a relationship with Catherine. In this relationship, Catherine bore him 4 children in the course of the 1370s. Each of these children was illegitimate, and they were given an artificial surname, a common practice amongst royal families in late medieval and early modern times. In this case, the children were given the surname Beaufort. This is assumed to have been derived from the manor of Beaufort, in the Champagne region of northeastern France, where John spent much of the 1370s, and where the first of the 4 children, John Beaufort, 1st Earl of Somerset, was born. The unusual thing was that in 1396, 2 years after Constance's death, Gaunt finally married Catherine. A year later, he convinced King Richard to retroactively legitimize his children who had grown up as illegitimate. The issue of whether the Beaufort line, which theoretically formed a branch of the House of Lancaster, could hold a claim to the throne would emerge prominently many decades later. The final stages of John of Gaunt's life were comparatively uneventful. He resided at Leicester Castle, finally married to Catherine after many years of her being his mistress. On the other hand, he was doing his best not to ruffle any feathers. After being chastened by the Lords Appellant back in 1388, Richard II had begun to reassert himself in the 1390s. While the king remained broadly on good terms with his uncle, he did not entirely forget the role that John's son Henry Bolingbroke played in the unrest back in the 1380s. Henry decided to make himself scarce in order to avoid any retribution. He took part in 2 different crusades, to Lithuania in the 1390s, when the Teutonic Knights, a religious order, were at war with the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Back home in England in 1397, Richard felt strong enough to seek retribution for the opposition he had faced nearly a decade earlier. He had 2 of the leading Lords Appellant from the period between 1386 and 1388, Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, and Richard Fitzalan, Earl of Arundel and Surrey, killed. A third, Thomas de Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, was stripped of his lands. This was a highly inflammatory act, not least because Gloucester was Richard's uncle and John of Gaunt's brother, the youngest of King Edward III's adult sons. Little wonder, then, that Richard was soon overthrown himself. Such was the dismay at his actions.
Bolingbroke was exiled to France in 1398. However, he returned the following year, after John of Gaunt died early in 1399, and Richard moved to prohibit him from succeeding as Duke of Lancaster. As we have seen, support for Richard evaporated, and Henry successfully usurped the throne, after which he imprisoned his cousin and seems to have had him starved to death in captivity.
Henry Bolingbroke now ascended as King Henry IV, the first monarch of the House of Lancaster. Henry had been at the centre of English politics and at the forefront of opposition to Richard for over a decade by the time he rose to the throne. However, he was still just 32 years of age when he became King of England. He could feasibly have looked forward to a long and successful reign like his grandfather, Edward III. Events were to prove otherwise, though. Only a few months into the new reign, in 1400, unrest began on the border between Wales and the English West Midlands, where the Welsh Lord Owain Glyndŵr had quarrelled with Reynold Grey, Baron of Ruthyn. The English crown had controlled Wales since the days of King Edward I, who pacified the country in the late 13th century. Glyndŵr's local dispute with Grey escalated from 1400, and he emerged as the leader of a national revolt, in which he claimed the title of Prince of Wales. The Glyndŵr rebellion would last for 15 years, and would only be finally brought to an end after Henry IV was dead. It cast a pall over his reign, and also led to unrest amongst the English lords. Most notably, Sir Henry Percy, known colloquially as Henry Hotspur, revolted against the new king in 1403. All of this ensured that Henry was unable to revive the war effort against the French. Furthermore, within a few years of claiming the throne, his health was declining. Historians remain divided on what his exact illness was. The symptoms included a severe skin disease, perhaps leprosy. From 1405 on, he was frequently incapacitated, and it was no surprise when he died at just 45 years of age on the 20th of March 1413. Henry IV's extended bouts of illness meant that even before he died, his eldest son and heir, Henry of Monmouth, was playing a considerable role in the governance of the kingdom. Bolingbroke had 6 children with his first wife, Mary de Bohun. The eldest of these, the future King Henry V, was born on the 16th of September 1386. 2 of their daughters had ended up marrying into European royal and aristocratic houses, notably the youngest of their 6 children, Philippa. She married Eric VII of Denmark in 1406, who also ruled over Norway and Sweden at the time. This means the House of Lancaster would have contributed to the Danish, Norwegian and Swedish royal lines in late medieval times, had it not been for the fact that her marriage to Eric was childless. Still, she played a major role in Scandinavian politics in the first half of the 15th century. Her older brother succeeded their father in 1413. King Henry V was only 26 years of age when he became the new monarch. However, his reputation was formidable already by then. While his father's health declined, Henry had led the war effort against Owain Glyndŵr. The Welsh were fully pacified early in his reign, after Glyndŵr died in Wales. As early as 1410, after forming an alliance with his Beaufort cousins, the legitimised children from John of Gaunt's lengthy affair with Catherine Swynford, he effectively took control of the government. It was clear for all to see, when he was crowned in April 1413, that the new king was a young man with energy, purpose and drive, who would rejuvenate England. He would do this after decades of civil war, regional revolts, and humiliations at the hands of the French. The latter issue was Henry V's main focus. With Glyndŵr dead in 1415 and Wales pacified, Henry was determined to revive the war with the French crown. The 100 Years' War had devolved into a kind of ceasefire by the early 15th century. In its earliest stages, back between the outbreak in 1337 and the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360, the English had the better of the conflict and had recaptured a significant amount of territory lost back in the days of King John. Despite the best efforts of Henry V's grandfather, John of Gaunt, and his great-uncle, the Black Prince, England had failed to make a breakthrough when the war resumed in the 1360s and 1370s. Richard II's reign had then been a disaster for English arms on the continent, and the war had been practically abandoned for protracted periods of time, as England lost some of its allies like the Duke of Brittany. Distractions in the shape of domestic revolts and his own illness meant Henry IV could not revive the war. Now his son was determined to do so. In 1415, he invaded Normandy in northern France with a large army, commencing what is often termed the Lancastrian phase of the 100 Years' War, in recognition that it was led by monarchs of the House of Lancaster. Henry V's leadership was enormously successful. He won the greatest victory achieved by the English in the entirety of the 100 Years' War, at the Battle of Agincourt, on the 25th of October 1415. Here the English longbow devastated a numerically superior army of French cavalry. The French crown was weakened for years to come, after losing thousands of troops. The English position was strengthened, although the real benefactor was England's ally, the Duchy of Burgundy, which expanded its territory at the expense of the French crown. While the Burgundians gained more immediately from Agincourt, the battle ultimately led to the signing of the Treaty of Troyes between the English and the French in 1420. Under the terms of this, the French conceded that when King Charles VI of France died, Henry would succeed him as King of France. This would constitute the fulfillment of the claim which Edward III had made to the French throne 80 years earlier, back in 1340. Charles was in his early 50s already by then, and had not ruled effectively for many years, having suffered from severe psychological issues which had incapacitated him. To cement the arrangement, Henry V married one of Charles's daughters, Catherine of Valois, in 1420 as well. Hence, the plan was that Henry V would claim the French throne within a few years once Charles died, and a Lancastrian would rule both England and France. And it all might have worked too. Charles died on the 21st of October 1422, 2.5 years after the Treaty of Troyes was signed. Unfortunately, however, Henry V had predeceased him by 2 months. In the late summer of 1422, he became severely ill while campaigning in France and died on the 31st of August. Opinion is divided as to what he died from, with theories ranging from dysentery to smallpox, to some other underlying condition exacerbated by heatstroke. What this meant is that Henry's sole child from his marriage to Catherine in 1420, an infant named Henry as well, came to the throne as King Henry VI at the end of August 1422. This third monarch of the House of Lancaster was less than 9 months old, having been born on the 6th of December, 1421. Even before Henry V had taken ill and died, the French had been reneging on the terms of the Treaty of Troyes. Their own war effort was finally recovering under the surprising leadership of Joan of Arc. Therefore, when Charles VI died 2 months after Henry V, the French were hardly going to accept an English infant as their new king. Instead, one of Charles VI's younger sons, also named Charles, claimed the throne as King Charles VII. He would revive French military fortunes and rejuvenate French royal power over the course of a long reign. Meanwhile, in England, a minority government was being created that would rule on behalf of Henry VI. Because the new Lancastrian monarch was so young when he succeeded to the throne, This regency government would last for a long time. The central figure within it initially was Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, the youngest son of King Henry IV, and thus Henry VI's uncle. He became Lord Protector of England during Henry's minority. In addition, young Henry's Lancastrian cousins from the Beaufort line of the family also played a growing role in the regency government as the years went by. They oversaw a dramatic reversal of the war in France. In the late 1420s, the English lost the extended siege of Orleans. Then, in 1435, Charles VII of France signed the Treaty of Arras with the Burgundians and deprived England of its main ally on the continent. The really catastrophic period, though, came between 1449 and 1453, by which time Henry VI was a grown man, ruling in his own right. During these years, the English suffered a series of military defeats and lost virtually all of their territories in Normandy and in western France around Bordeaux. By the end of 1453, the English had only Calais left. This was the development seen as marking the end of the 100 Years' War, which had concluded with a French victory. The collapse of the war effort in France and the seeming weakness of the House of Lancaster provided an opportunity for the rise and increased threat from amongst the descendants of King Edward III. Henry VI's reign could not have gone worse. Henry could not be blamed for the reverses of the 1420s or even the 1430s in the war with France. But by the late 1440s, Henry was now a grown man, ruling in his own right. Under Henry's rule, decisive blows were struck against England in the loss of towns and cities like Rouen in Normandy and Bordeaux in western France between 1449 and 1453. The view was that he was responsible for the calamity that had befallen England's continental empire. The contempt many felt towards him and his government was in sharp contrast to the popularity of Richard, 3rd Duke of York. Richard was the son of Richard of Conisbrough, the 3rd Earl of Cambridge, a younger son of Edmund of Langley, the 1st Duke of York. Edmund was the 5th son of King Edward III. Therefore, the 3rd Duke was the great-grandson of old King Edward, cousin of King Henry VI. Born in 1411, he was 10 years older than Henry VI and was an established war leader in France by the time the king began to rule as an adult. The years in which Richard was a senior military commander in France were comparatively good ones for the final stage of the 100 Years' War. He didn't win major successes, but he kept the French at bay in the late 1430s and early 1440s. Later, he was replaced by the king's Beaufort cousins, who were appointed to lead the war in France during its disastrous final years. Conversely, Richard was appointed as Lord Lieutenant of Ireland in 1447 and took up his position there in 1449. The view was, therefore, that York had kept the French at bay when he was in charge. In contrast, things had taken a turn for the worse when Henry and the Beauforts had taken over the war. In this way, York became a fulcrum for discontent towards the Lancastrians. Richard's time in Ireland had also built up an additional base of support for the Yorkists there. 1453 was a significant year in that it saw an end to the 100 Years' War. But for the English monarch, it also marked a crucial turning point. As news arrived of the military calamities in France, 31-year-old Henry VI suffered a psychological collapse. He became unresponsive to those around him and seemed to be unaware of what was happening. Even when his first son, Edward of Westminster, from his marriage to Margaret of Anjou, was born on the 13th of October 1453, Henry failed to snap out of his reverie. He would periodically recover in the years that followed, and was at least reachable. but Henry never ruled in an effective way again. Henceforth, the Lancastrian cause was largely led by his wife, Margaret of Anjou, a Frenchwoman, on behalf of their infant son, and a cohort of other Lancastrian cousins, primarily from the Beaufort family. They increasingly faced an opposing Yorkist faction. Even before Henry's mental collapse in 1453, the Duke of York had returned from Ireland, and there were growing calls for him to be placed in charge of the government. Strong leadership was needed. York was consequently made the Lord Protector of the realm several months after Henry suffered his collapse. Some stability was restored to affairs with Richard's appointment. Nevertheless, the civil war that had been brewing for years finally broke out, ironically just as Henry seemed to recover. The Wars of the Roses began in 1455. In December 1454, Henry VI had suddenly started to partially recover after being largely comatose for nearly a year and a half. As he recovered, nobles and ministers scrambled to try and claim power under a restored Lancastrian administration, in which York would no longer be required to serve as Lord Protector. As the Lancastrians moved to reassert themselves, others pressed York to hold on to power. There was no guarantee that Henry would not suffer another psychological collapse in the near future. In any event, the king had never been a strong ruler. York acquiesced to these growing calls, and war followed. The Wars of the Roses are known as such because the House of Lancaster's heraldic symbol included a red rose, while the House of York's bore a white rose. The initial stage of the conflict involved a seemingly decisive engagement. At the Battle of St Albans, north of London, on the 22nd of May 1455, the Yorkists defeated a Lancastrian force. Henry VI was captured by the Yorkists, and Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, was killed. This Edmund had been seen, along with Queen Margaret, as the real power behind the throne at the time. The Duke of York was subsequently restored to the position of Lord Protector. This placed the Yorkists in the ascendancy, but the conflict continued and reignited into a full-blown war again in 1459. By then, there were calls for Henry VI to be deposed altogether and the House of Lancaster to be overthrown, with Richard of York becoming the new king. York himself had largely been won over to this idea, believing that the instability would continue so long as Henry VI remained on the throne and continued to be used as a pawn by the Beauforts and others. Moreover, Henry was still not even 40 years old. If he remained on the throne and continued to suffer periodic bouts of mental collapse, this instability could continue for decades to come. Thus, when the Wars of the Roses resumed in 1459, it was clear that the Yorkist agenda was to usurp the House of Lancaster and claim the throne for themselves. Richard, 3rd Duke of York, would never become King of England. On the 30th of December 1460, after he had occupied Sandal Castle in the north of England, Richard forayed out against a Lancastrian force. In the ensuing Battle of Wakefield, he was killed along with several prominent supporters. Initially, this appeared to be a great boon to the Lancastrian cause, but Richard was immediately succeeded by his 18-year-old son, Edward, 4th Duke of York. Edward was an immensely capable young man, and in the weeks that followed, he won 2 decisive victories over the Lancastrians at the Battle of Mortimer's Cross and the Battle of Towton. The latter engagement, which took place in Yorkshire on the 29th of March 1461, was the most significant battle of the Wars of the Roses, and the one which, more than any other, crushed the Lancastrian cause. It involved tens of thousands of men. The Lancastrians were led by Henry Beaufort, 3rd Duke of Somerset, the de facto head of the Lancastrian cause, given the king's inherent weaknesses. The Lancastrians were heavily defeated at Towton. losing thousands of men. King Henry, Queen Margaret, their son, and the other Lancastrian leaders fled north to Scotland as a result of the defeat. Edward, Duke of York, was proclaimed as King Edward IV of England, bringing to an end the rule of the House of Lancaster that Henry IV had established just 62 years earlier. Edward was crowned in the summer of 1461 in London. On the face of it, this decisive battle at Towton had brought to an end the rule of the House of Lancaster. But the house itself had not come to an end. As long as there were Lancastrians, the war would continue. Pockets of Lancastrian resistance continued to exist around England until Yorkist success at the Battle of Hexham largely pacified the country in May 1464. Henry VI was captured not long afterwards and was placed in the Tower of London. His cousin, the new king, decided not to execute him. Firstly, this was an act of mercy towards an ill individual who was merely a pawn of the wider Lancastrian faction. Secondly, if Edward had killed Henry, the Lancastrian claim to the throne would have simply transferred to Henry's son, Edward of Westminster, who was still at large with Henry's wife, Margaret of Anjou. The former queen was looking for support in Scotland and France to revive the Lancastrian cause. Therefore, it was safer to keep Henry alive and prisoner in the Tower of London. Meanwhile, Edward IV began to try to rule as a normal monarch. His hopes were to go to war in France again and to pacify Ireland, only a portion of which was under effective English control at the time. The deposed King Henry VI did not languish forever in the Tower of London. In 1470, a remarkable series of events took place which briefly brought the House of Lancaster back to power in England. As the 1460s had gone on, many of those who had supported Edward in overthrowing the Lancastrians became disillusioned with his rule. These included Richard Neville, 16th Earl of Warwick, a noble so powerful and wealthy that he was capable of swinging the Wars of the Roses in favour of one faction or the other. He is known today as Warwick the Kingmaker. Such was his influence over the course of the wars. Neville was dissatisfied with how Edward had rewarded him after becoming king. Now Neville began to contact the Lancastrian faction. Another malcontent was Edward IV's own brother, George, Duke of Clarence. In 1470, Warwick allied with Margaret of Anjou and arrived at London to overthrow Edward. They succeeded in doing so and retrieved Henry VI from the Tower of London. They then placed him back on the throne, an act known as the readaptation of Henry VI. This restoration of the House of Lancaster proved short-lived though. Edward briefly fled to the Low Countries and gathered his supporters and mercenaries there. He then returned to England, and in April and May of 1471 won two conclusive battles against the new Lancastrian faction at Barnet and Tewkesbury. Warwick was killed in the fighting at Barnet. Having won these battles, Edward entered London and reclaimed the throne. There would be no loose ends left this time. Edward of Westminster, Henry VI's son and heir, died at the Battle of Tewkesbury. When Edward reclaimed the capital, he had Henry discreetly killed on the 21st of May 1471. With this secret execution, the direct line of the House of Lancaster came to an end. Of course, there was a coda of sorts to all of this. Edward IV died in 1483, when he was just 40 years old. His son and heir, Edward V, was only 12 years old when his father died, and so, shortly before his death, Edward IV had named his brother Richard as Lord Protector during his son's minority. Richard infamously placed the young king and his other nephew in the Tower of London, and presumably ordered them to be killed not long after. He then claimed the throne himself and became King Richard III. This heinous act aroused widespread opposition, and a new claimant to the throne quickly emerged. This was Henry Tudor, the son of a Welsh lord Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, and his wife Margaret Beaufort. Margaret was the great-granddaughter of John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford. This, therefore, meant that Henry Tudor was a great-great-great-grandson of King Edward III on his mother's side. He could lay claim to being a Lancastrian as a result of being a great-great-grandson of John of Gaunt. However, while the Beaufort line had been legitimised back in the 1390s after Gaunt had married Catherine Swynford, the provision had been that the Beauforts could not lay claim to the throne. Therefore, Henry Tudor's claim to the throne on the basis of his Beaufort heritage was very dubious in law. It didn't matter in the end, though. As is well known, Henry crossed to England from France in 1485, where he then defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field. Richard died fighting, while Henry now claimed the throne as King Henry VII, the first monarch of the House of Tudor. To cement his claim to the throne, he married Elizabeth of York, King Edward IV's daughter. In this, Henry unified the White Rose of York and the Red Rose of Lancaster in the shape of the new Tudor dynasty. Although Henry Tudor might have tried to suggest he was a Lancastrian claimant to the throne, few were in any doubt that the House of Lancaster was gone after the Wars of the Roses came to an end. Henry faced several revolts against his rule, but they all came from Yorkist pretenders, not Lancastrians. The direct royal line descended from John of Gaunt and Henry IV had died out by the 1480s, and nearly all of the prominent Beauforts had been killed in the Wars of the Roses. The Duchy of Lancaster remained a crown possession. When Edward IV had become the first Yorkist ruler in 1461, he had decided that the duchy would become a distinct part of the crown estate held under special jurisdiction. Henry VII continued this dispensation. It consequently remained a part of the royal estate throughout the 16th century and into the reign of the House of Stuart in the 17th. The main blip occurred between 1649 and 1660 after the English Parliament executed King Charles I and England briefly became a republic. During this 11-year period, the duchy became a government estate. Rents and profits from it were used to fund the government at a time when lots of soldiers needed to be paid off for their service during the English Civil Wars. With the restoration of the monarchy and the accession of King Charles II in 1660, the duchy passed back into the hands of the monarchy. Hence, while the House of Lancaster had long passed from the scene, the estate of John of Gaunt had a much more protracted history. The Duchy of Lancaster continued as part of the wider Crown estate into the 18th century. This occurred as the politics of the country was changing irrevocably. Firstly, a new branch of the royal family came to power in 1714 after Queen Anne, the last of the direct line of the House of Stuart, died, excluding her Roman Catholic half-brother on the continent, who was prohibited from succeeding her. Consequently, her German cousin, the Elector of Hanover, George Ludwig, succeeded as George I, first monarch of Great Britain of the House of Hanover. His right to rule was on account of being the great-grandson of King James I, the first monarch of the House of Stuart. Significant political changes had, however, taken place in the 17th century at the time of the Civil Wars and the Glorious Revolution. The monarch's power was in constant decline relative to the growing power of Parliament. By the middle of the 18th century, this change was manifested in discussions about the merits of the Crown estate being kept under the control of the royal family. These discussions included the Duchy of Lancaster. along with concerns over the customs duties and other revenues which still went directly to the crown, rather to the government. The crown estate was massive, generating large sums of money, which could be used to partially finance the expanding government apparatus. Talks around this time came to a head when George III succeeded to the throne in 1760. An agreement was reached called the Civil List Act of 1760. Under its terms, the majority of the Crown estate was surrendered to the government. This meant that the revenues from those lands could be used going forward to pay the salaries of government officials. In return, George III and the other royals would receive annual payments of hundreds of thousands of pounds, millions in today's money, from Parliament. However, because the Duchy of Lancaster had a different legal status and had been created as a county palatine in medieval times, the duchy remained under the direct ownership of the Crown. Hence, the legacy of the House of Lancaster was preserved into modern times. In more recent times, the duchy has been a source of revenue for the Crown and also controversy from time to time. Several of George III's sons had been spendthrift drains on the exchequer, who had required money from Parliament beyond what the civil list and other rules had allowed for. His eldest son in particular, who became King George IV in 1820, had spent well beyond his means. This had led many to question whether the civil list should be retained in its current format. It also raised the issue of whether the elements of the Crown estate which remained under direct Crown ownership should be taken under the management of the nation. In the end, the two main remaining components of the Crown estate, the Duchy of Lancaster and the Duchy of Cornwall, were left in the hands of the Crown as a compromise between King William IV and Parliament. This was in order to acquire King William's begrudging support for the Great Reform Act of 1832, legislation which began to extend the voting franchise to a wider proportion of the British male population. Further attempts were made to have the Crown relinquish the Duchy of Lancaster to the nation in the 19th and 20th centuries. Each of them failed, and the duchy is still directly owned by the Crown to this day. Curiously, British governments in modern times appoint a minister without portfolio as the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, although in reality the office is a sinecure and the Chancellor plays no real role in managing the duchy. Instead, in modern Britain, the royal family directly owns the duchy. Today, the duchy acts as a 45,000-acre reminder that a long time ago, for slightly more than 60 years, between 1399 and 1461, the House of Lancaster ruled England before being supplanted by their Yorkist cousins. The House of Lancaster was one of the two great houses that emerged from the collapse of royal authority on two different occasions in the century following the death of King Edward III. The House of Lancaster ultimately stemmed from John of Gaunt, the third of Edward's 5 adult sons. He was granted the dukedom of Lancaster in 1362 as a result of his marriage to Blanche, the daughter of Henry, Duke of Lancaster. It is from this that the name of the House of Lancaster derives. With his extensive lands and power base in the north, John became the most powerful noble in the realm, following the death of his father and the accession of his nephew Richard II, while still a child, in 1377. Yet, despite the inherent weakness of Richard's rule and the way in which he alienated the English political community, John never tried to claim the throne for himself. That action fell to his son, Henry Bolingbroke, in 1399, just months after John's death. It is a sign of how poorly Richard had ruled that Henry was able to return from exile and effect a virtually bloodless usurpation of the throne in the summer of 1399. Henry did all of this while Richard was campaigning in Ireland. In power as Henry IV, the first of the Lancastrian kings from the autumn of 1399 onwards, Henry faced several major rebellions and died in 1413 after a lengthy illness. His son Henry V also died prematurely in 1422, though not before winning a famous victory over the French at Agincourt in 1415 and reviving English fortunes in the 100 Years' War. It was the misfortune of the Lancastrians that the throne then fell to Henry VI, an infant at the time of his succession in 1422. Henry's regency government was followed by an adult reign, in which, during the crucial year of 1453, he suffered a psychological collapse, and England lost the 100 Years' War simultaneously. These dual setbacks provided the basis for Richard, Duke of York, to lay claim to the throne, triggering the Wars of the Roses in the process. Over 30 years of conflict followed, though ultimately the House of Lancaster's direct claim to the throne came to an end in 1471, when both Henry and his son Edward of Westminster were killed by King Edward IV and the Yorkists. The Lancastrian claim to the throne was revived in a tenuous legal manner by Henry Tudor, a Welshman who managed to overthrow the Yorkists and establish the House of Tudor as the new royal family in 1485. Ultimately, the House of Lancaster came to power on the back of one poor ruler, Richard II, being overthrown. It then lost power little over 60 years later, as a result of one of its own members proving incapable of effective rule. All of this highlights the need for effective kingship in late medieval Europe. What do you think of the House of Lancaster? Could Henry Tudor really be said to constitute a continuation of the Lancastrian line in a way? Or did he seize the throne in 1485 on a very tenuous basis? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.